Alright, so today we're going to add validation to what we did before, and we're going to add both client-side and server-side validation. I would expect that the client-side validation be largely reviewed, but there is a twist because we are now actually submitting something to the server. If you think of like the coin example and some of the other examples we did earlier in the semester, we had validation in there, but the validation was never used in conjunction with sending something to the server. And that makes this a little bit different, because what we want to do is if I click the submit button and I don't have valid data, I want to block it from submitting it to the server. Alright, so I have to do something a little bit extra than that we haven't done before in the previous example. So I will take a little bit of time to go over that and show you how it's different. And then we'll go on to the server-side validation. The reason, of course, that you do both client and server-side validation is because, first of all, people can turn off the client-side validation. That's always a danger, that JavaScript can be disabled. And therefore, if you had something, some kind of validation that was critical, that you could enter in a negative amount due or something, you would want that sort of validation to prevent your data from being compromised. So you will have redundant validation. In addition, remember that on the server side you have access to more resources, so you can do a more thorough validation. And the classic example of that is on the client side we could check to make sure that we entered a credit card number that looked like a valid credit card number. In other words, there's rules for credit card numbers that you can tell if they're valid just by looking at them. There are a certain number of digits. Credit card number of 12 would not be a valid credit card number. I think the digits that they begin with are you could easily validate. But more detailed information, like for example, is it a credit card number that really is legit? That has actually been issued and not just matches the form of a valid credit card number. Or is it a credit card that has been reported stolen? Things like that would require accessing a database to tell. And therefore we could not do that on the server side, because we can't have database access. We could not do that on the client side. We would have to do that on the server side, because on the client side we can't access the database. We have to go through the server for that. So, in a nutshell, we are going to repeat the validation that we have on the client side, just in case someone turns off the client side, and in addition, we are going to possibly add some additional validation that could only be performed on the server side. So, I'm downloading what we had before, and we're going to add some quick client-side validation to it to make sure, and we're going to block it from submitting if it doesn't pass validation. So I'm going to go into my calculator page and edit with Notepad, and I know you can't see this right now, so I'll go and turn on the projector. we have my form tag that has an action of check range. We have a method of get. Check range is the name of the script it's going to be called. It's assumed to be on the same server in the same folder. That's why it's just the file name. Method is get, which means the data is going to be passed via the query string, as opposed to post, which means it will be passed as part of the request. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an on submit. And I'm going to do it wrong first. And then I'm going to go and do it right. All right. Notice in the past we've done things like saying on click of the button validate form. Well, here we're doing it on the on submit. I could put that on the submit button and say on click do this, but regardless of how the form is submitted, if you submit it other ways, I am going to call the validation of the form. Now, what's wrong with this is not necessarily obvious. What's wrong with it is that the way it is now, it will perform the form validation before it's submitted, but there's nothing to keep the form from submitting if the form validation returns that the form is not valid. All right? So if I put this in here, it's going to go and it's going to do the form validation, but then regardless of the result of the validation, whether it succeeds or fails, it's going to then go and continue and submit to the server. And that's not what we want to have happen. We want, if the validation returns a false, to stop the presses and prevent the data from being submitted to the server. Because at that point, if the data is not valid, the server can't possibly process it correctly. So we need to stop the validation. So I can fix that with one word, and that is return. And the way it works is something like this. I call the validate form method. That validate form method, I haven't written it yet, but when I do write it, it is going to return a true or a false. True means that, yes, it's okay to go ahead, the form is valid, you can go ahead and submit the form to the server. That's what a true means. A false means that there's something wrong with the form and I should not submit the form to the server. I should just keep it right here on this page. If I say return validate form, that true or false gets sent back to this on submit event. All right? And a true will let the submit continue, a false will block it. So if this function returns a false, that gets sent to the onSubmit method, and the onSubmit method cancels it. So simply by putting the word return here, we are telling the submit or the onSubmit method whether to continue or not. A return of false will stop the event from happening, whereas a return of true will continue it. All right, so I can now go in my JavaScript, and I can write my method. Put my script tag in. And txt age and txt beats. And I'm going to put a span here to hold any errors that I get. be valid equals true. Remember, the way that we're writing this is that we're assuming that it's true unless we find otherwise. We're assuming that the form is valid until we find an error. And I'm going to have an error message that I'm going to form. And we're going to initialize it as an empty string. Now I have all my validation conditions. So I can say if document get element by ID txt age equals an empty string. Then I can say be valid is false. And I can add on to str errors equals missing age. I could put all the conditions for validating the form there. And I'm not going to do that in this case, but would check the beats to make sure that something was entered, and would check to see is NaN. Would check to see if the age or the beats was not a number. Because if it was not a number, it's also not valid. All right. When we're done, we simply say document get element by ID errors dot inner HTML equals str errors. I don't want that in quotes. I want the value of the variable. And then finally, I want to return be valid. All right, so let's see how this works. This is basically the kind of validation we did all the time in there. The only difference is that I have that word return in there. I'm taking the value that this returns and I'm telling the onSubmit function whether to continue submitting the form or not. So let me save this. Let me go and copy all of this over to CINet pub www. We'll clear out what was there before. Copy all these guys over there. And I go to localhost. I go to my calculator. And notice what happens if I click calculate. If I click calculate, there's nothing in age. We got a problem because it went and submitted anyhow. Oh, yeah. Duh. You're absolutely right. Yeah, I put the two brackets right there. So it thought that was the whole function. So it went and did nothing and said, yeah, okay, it's okay to validate. So I need to go and put that there. good call. So let's try copying this over again. And still having an issue. Oh, dot value. I could tell it was wrong because it was going ahead and doing the submit anyhow, even though I didn't give valid data. So now I go, and I'm just going to quit. All right, how am I going to debug this? That's a good question, because if I go and hit calculate, and I go and try to view the errors, the JavaScript errors, it's going to give me the JavaScript errors for this page. And there aren't any JavaScript errors on this page, the JavaScript errors are on the previous page. And I'm already submitting that page, so I leave that page, and the problem is that it's submitting it when it shouldn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to temporarily change this to a button. And copy this over and make it an on-click event. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want it always to stay on that first page, regardless of whether the submit succeeded or not. So by changing it to a button, I'm going to keep it on that first page. And that way I have a chance to analyze what errors it made. All right. Cannot read property value of null. All right. On line 12. Document get element by ID, text age. Oh, I know what I did. I have a name, not an ID. Remember, the name is what is needed on the server side. The ID is used mainly on the client side to both for JavaScript and possibly for CSS, and for if I went and created a label tag for this. So I need to make these guys have IDs. Alright, so now I should be able to, I'm going to test it one more time with this as not a submit button. Alright, didn't give me an error. It didn't submit it, alright, me that the age is missing. It didn't submit it, didn't try to submit it, but that's because I took out the actual submit. So let's go in and let's restore the submit. And now, if I hit calculate, it tells me the age is missing, and it doesn't go to that page. If I do fill in the page, however, if I do fill in the data, it does submit it to the other page. Okay. So good debugging technique. If your validate form doesn't work and you might be getting a JavaScript error, change it to a button so that it does not try to submit it to the other page, and put it on click event to call your validation. All right, that's all the validation I'm going to do on the client side. Not because that's the only validation we could do. We could check to make sure it's not a number and all that. But I'm going to say that for the server side. I'm going to pretend that it's the kind of validation that I can't do on the client side. And therefore, I'm going to add the extra validation on the server side. All right, that way we can see an example where it has both client and server validation. And sure enough, if I go in and go to my calculator and type garbage in here, yeah, it kind of gives me garbage results. It tells me I'm in the range, but it doesn't really tell me anything meaningful. Effectively, what it does is it assumes that the age is 0. Like if I left off beats per second, it's telling me I'm below because it assumes it's 0. That's sort of a weakness of a weakly type language. In other words, PHP variable types are pretty much however you're using them. So if I say that I'm using it like a number, it will go and it will try to use the value as a number no matter what. And if it happens that it's not a number, it will actually, just assume it's 0. In fact, if I do something like this, 50x, or 50z, my beat per 60 seconds is 15x. It tells me I'm above. How does it tell me I'm above? Well, it took 50z and interpreted it as 50. That's the number part. All right. It took 15x and interpreted it as 15. So it did this example as though I was a 50-year-old person and my pulse was 15 in 6 seconds. If I put 12 in here, let's say, it should tell me that I'm in the range. All right. Again, that's how weakly typed languages work. Weakly typed languages take a shot. If you say you want to use this value in a mathematical expression, it will try to do it. All right? It will try to do it. And in the case of a number, if there's some numbers and then some characters, it will take the first part of it and interpret that as the number part, and it will do the math on that. So that's why it took 50x or 50z, and it acted as though my age was 50 years old. Well, that's probably not a good idea, right? We want more control over it than that.